Before I'd like to begin, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet here today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. This land is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. And of course, I'd also like to thank the organizers for basically putting this wonderful conference together. It is very needed, and I would hope that we would bring it to Sydney, because that's where I'm from. All right, so. At the very heart of occupation is the occupier telling the occupied how to react to occupation, and then telling everyone else how to react too. Israel has a right to self-defense. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Palestinians are human shields. And yes, my eye starts to twitch now every time I hear one of those lines. And so on and so forth. Israel had an armory of catchy and compelling one-liners during the brutal Operation Protective Edge in 2014. As expected, to match the might of its ground offensive on Gaza, Israel launched a media campaign to smokescreen the atrocities in return for worldwide sympathy. But unlike the previous attacks on Gaza in the past decade, the pervasiveness of social media has reached new heights, giving a platform to powerful, alternative, and new sources and voices. Traditionally, Israel has controlled and managed the global information stream framed by the penultimate principle, an assurance, no, an absolute right, that Israel and its Jewish people will survive. Therefore, survival is, of course, indivisible with Israel's political ontology. Survival is synonymous with Israel's constant state of violence. But myth and reality are rendered incompatible if the Zionist project and its followers are to be absolved of its violence, morally and on an international stage. Israel has used and continues to use its sophisticated technological, militaristic, and economic strength to propagate myths, a spectrum of omissions, distortions, and hate discourses from the top down, be it through a leaked step-by-step guide on how to show empathy and evade questions for spokespeople like Mark Regev, or much more recently, handing out information kits for Israelis studying abroad, listing the lies and truths about Israel. It would come then as no surprise that after years of indoctrination, most Western news outlets are thus biased in favor of Israel, skewed at best, one-sided at worst in their media reports, both online and off, which include one or more of the following: tables and graphs with Palestinian attacks on Israeli citizens, quotes from senior Israeli officials, if not the Prime Minister himself, fabrication of news, for example, showing destroyed Palestinian houses as Israeli ones, or as Noura mentioned earlier, malls from Malaysia. Examples of Palestinian-only violence, such as violent hashtags Palestinians have created, or cartoons showing violent Arabs. All such elements deemed unacceptable by an objective and balanced Western media that can only sympathize with the colonizer, helping to foster that magnanimous fantasy by giving a voice to the Israelis only at every turn. And the Palestinian existence, if any, is relegated to 2 to 3 lines, brief, vague, watered down, with no mention of occupation, of international law, of human rights abuses, or the war crimes committed. Take a recent mainstream example, and no prizes for guessing here, reporting in the immediate aftermath of Operation Cast Lead and again Protective Edge, with only the UN and Israeli estimates on militants killed worth reporting, and Israeli figures on Israeli death toll, something that Bernard Keane actually mentioned earlier today as well. So while the lean, mean Israeli Hasbara machine continues to mass-produce slogans like a factory conveyor belt, the current ecosystem of new media, including videos, memes, and critical analyses consisting of 140 characters, has certainly changed the rules of the game. Information and visuals are disseminating much more widely and freely. This has become as much an unprecedented war of words and wits as it is of weapons, with both Israeli and Palestinian officials battling to influence public opinion using social media. A true testament to the patriarchal, normalized culture of violence, if ever there were any, the Israeli military even introduced its own YouTube channel and Twitter account to show surveillance and airstrikes, launching assaults on our lands and on our screens. From the Jewish Agency and Ministry of Public Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs to university campuses across Israel and celebrity spokespeople, all have been recruited into the National Hasbara Brigade, with social media coordinators, rapid response teams, and volunteers armed with computers and a set of talking points, propaganda soldiers taking the war to cyberspace. The role of social media especially came to the forefront after Israel's decision to impose a media blackout on Gaza during Operation Protective Edge. Not only were journalists banned from entering Gaza, but even IDF soldiers were barred from bringing in their phones, probably to avoid photos of them doing unspeakable things to the dead and then posting it up on Facebook for likes. The effect of this media ban was twofold: allowing Israel to supply the facts and propping journalists at the borders to report stories that are more susceptible to Israeli framing. So those in Gaza had no choice but to turn to social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter to share live updates, minute-by-minute tweets, photos, and posts with people around the world who for the first time ever witnessed firsthand personal accounts of the atrocities. This significant shift in coverage worked to undermine the long dominant Israeli narrative: no governments, no journalists, no middlemen. Both Facebook and Twitter in particular also played a critical role in facilitating events around the world that mobilized activists and individuals to take action, to hold rallies, to talk to their local MPs, to speak to media. Locally, for example, groups were extremely active, and new online initiatives like the Gaza Advocacy Project were created to give people an outlet. However, this was short-lived, without a crisis to keep momentum, and this is part of the problem. Here in Australia, we cannot afford to fall into the trap of rest. The real work is in the casual, the continuous, the day-to-day, the spaces in between the big moments. We need to invest our energy and build on platforms relentlessly. So ultimately, indeed, social media is capable of revealing new truths, but it is not the cure for all ills. These social network sites, they promote unsanitized instant responses and short attention spans, not in-depth media coverage or physical mobilization. We won't win or maintain the moral high ground with only sporadic snippets and sound bites. First, we need to understand the psyche behind the messaging. We can't simply readapt the settler standpoint on survival or pander to assure their safety and comfort. We must crack their ethno-nationalist supremacy to the very core. And second, we must stop being on the back foot, so intellectually and culturally defensive. From the onset, the colonial project has shaped the way we resist, defined the agenda, and perpetuated it insidiously. Cultural and linguistic colonialism must be deprived of its oxygen in the virtual world and in the real one. We must make Palestinians human in every way on our own terms, in every positive and every insecurity, for more than just mere non-existence. We must unpack the years of Orientalism embedded in our images everywhere. And we must do this in a way that works for our Facebook news feeds, because we know that's where people get their news today. We must use the democratization of the online sphere in our favor, be it via permanent platforms such as Electronic Intifada, shameless plug, or hashtags in crisis like Gaza Under Attack, or shareable videos like those of Break the Silence. We need strategy and we need sharp internet advocacy, from the talking points to the clickbait lists, if we are to continue to stir consciences and garner global support, as Ramzy Baroud was talking about earlier. Where reality is stranger than fiction, social media is a tool that can extend collective compassion and empathy. We must go further than resisting through remembrance alone. We must force Israel into a perennial state of existential anxiety. Social media is an avenue to do this. We have an opportunity to reframe the language and counter the buzzwords, so no more security barrier, or wave of violence, or decades of unresolved conflict, or rioting Palestinians. We can come together to produce clever, clickable content. We can reflect the reality on the ground by creating our own humanizing stories and building social relationships mediated by images and hashtags. And most importantly, wherever people are talking about colonization, about racism, wherever injustice is being challenged, that's where we need to be. We must be present everywhere, a universal symbol of an aspiration to freedom, justice, and equality. Thank you.